shortly introduce Berndt Keller. Berndt Keller is Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Labor Relations at University of Constance. And he is an expert on unions and labor relations and on atypical employment and precarious employment, to name just a few of the topics. And we are very happy to have you both here and to listen to your conversation on this very interesting topic, a topic that is interesting on its own, but a topic that I'm sure will round down this conference very nicely and reconnect to our topic in our research alliance on labor standards of improved well-being. So this is very interesting, and welcome again, and thank you so much for preparing this conversation for us. And just a final organizational remark, as Ortrud has already said in the morning, the time slot for this conversation is, of course, 45 minutes, as well as all the other time slots for the conversations were too. So thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours, and I hand over to Berndt now.
Okay, expectations are very high now. My first duty is, of course, to introduce David. That means, of course, in our circumstances, carrying wood into the forest. Anyhow, I can be very short. David is a professor of industrial relations at the London School of Economics and also an associate in the labor market research program within the Center of Economic Performance. Some of us know him because he is a former president of the Society for the Advancement of Socio-Economics. He is also a former editor of the Socio-Economic Review, and of special importance for German circumstances, he was one of the founding editors of Industrielle Beziehungen, our German Journal of Industrial Relations. Furthermore, I guess everybody has seen and probably even read his famous book, A Theory of Employment Systems, Micro Foundations of Societal Diversity, first edition by Oxford UP in 1999, and became well known shortly thereafter. Okay, this is my very short, maybe even unnecessary introduction. Now for the structure of the remaining 42 minutes. It will be a bit different from what we did yesterday and this morning, because the point of departure is a paper David has just published in the British Journal of Industrial Relations. So I would highly recommend take parts of tomorrow's 1st May, check the British Journal of Industrial Relations and read the paper. It's definitely rewarding. So, because this is a very sophisticated argument, we agreed that David will shortly introduce the main concept of his paper, and then we will start discussing, asking questions, giving answers, and we will have a final part of our conversation where David will answer questions that have been asked in the chat. So David, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Berndt, and thank you everyone for staying on to the end of this conference. It's been 2 hard days' work, although extremely interesting. I'll just share my screen.
Yes, it's okay.
Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Good, okay, thank you. Well, hold on. The core argument I'd like to present today is a very stripped down version of the paper, but I think it fits quite well within the context of the debates we've been having over the last 2 days. I'd like to take the starting point with the idea that the Betrieb, if I can anglicize that expression a little bit, has many different legal forms, encompasses very many different legal forms of ownership. And ownership is important, as Hart has argued, because it confers confers residual rights of control. In other words, the owners have the final word over the use of the assets which are being activated. And my question then is, what does this mean for employee well-being? Well, I think everyone is familiar with the work of the Stiglitz and Sen Commission, urging that a greater focus needs to be put on the non-material aspects of well-being in the economy, but also within employment. And for example, recognizing the scope that many employees feel they would like to have for satisfying intrinsic as well as extrinsic benefits from their work. So in the employment field then, Stiglitz and Sen would be pressing for a greater recognition of the importance of intrinsic work satisfaction and making this available to many more workers than is currently available. Now, why are intrinsic benefits problematic? Well, if we follow the findings of the Gallup survey, which is the Gallup World Employment Survey, years back, one of the striking findings was how many employees appear to derive very little intrinsic satisfaction from their work. Something like 80% of the respondents to their worldwide survey their response could basically be summarized as saying that they put in the hours to get the money, but that's the limit of their engagement in their work. Now, why might this occur? And when we do find this recognition of the intrinsic benefits of work, what can we learn about those conditions? So now the market solution, and I guess the standard treatment one would get from a first-year labor economics course, would be one could deal with this through the theory of compensating wage differentials. Workers value two outcomes. One is wages, and one is the subjective benefits that they get from their work in the form of intrinsic work benefits. And to some extent, they trade these off against each other. So one would think that perhaps workers would, who vary in their valuations of their intrinsic benefits and the weight that they wish to put on them, workers would seek jobs which offer the packages of extrinsic and intrinsic benefits that particularly appeal to them. And employers likewise would try and position themselves on the labour market in such a way that they could attract workers who have a particular package of intrinsic and extrinsic benefits in mind. And one could imagine some kind of market process working through that. Well, the problem with intrinsic work benefits, as Sen and Stiglitz note, is that they're very subjective, and they also vary considerably among employees. And if they're highly subjective and they vary greatly among employees, it makes it very difficult to write employment contracts which specify both the material extrinsic rewards and the subjective intrinsic rewards that would be offered. And that could get in the way of employees trading off one type of benefit against the other. Now, when the subjective benefits are hard to measure and hard to codify, it then makes the trade-off that's proposed by employers, it makes employees very dependent upon the degree of trust that they have in the insurances offered by their employers. How can I trust the employer to recognize the trade-off that I've made, accepting a lower wage in exchange for what's promised to be more interesting and more satisfying work, if it can't be written down in a contract? And also in the employment relationship, as we all know, the employer determines the tasks that we undertake, and we agree to let the employer make that choice officially in the interests of efficiency. But how do we know the employer is not going to renege on the promises about intrinsically interesting work and just take the benefit of the lower wage that I've agreed to, but then in the end not deliver on the side of the intrinsic benefits that I would like? Now, Of course, in many organizations, there are what we often refer to as implicit contracts, or psychologists talk about the psychological contract. These can play an important role in work relations. But one of the important features of these kind of psychological or implicit contracts is that because they're not written down, if there's a change of ownership of the organization, very often the implicit contracts don't get transferred. There's now a lot of legislation which enables explicit benefits to be transferred with the transfer of ownership of organizations. But as Schleifer has argued, and as Rose Batt has shown in some really interesting studies of implicit contracts, or the kind of things that would cover an agreement about the trade-off between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards, that kind of element is easily forgotten. The third party that buys the organization won't be terribly interested in that. And this could be a problem in the area of privately owned public corporations, where the assets or where the ownership itself is tradable. It can be bought and sold by other parties. What's written down and codified among the obligations of the firm that's being sold can be transferred. But what's implicit, what's a psychological contract, very often can't be transferred. And for that reason, one might think, therefore, that in many organizations, workers would be reluctant to agree to any kind of a sacrifice of pay in favor of subjective intrinsic benefits. They might take it as a kind of accident, but they won't take it as something which would be a firm basis for agreeing a trade-off. And the question then arises, are things different in organizations where ownership isn't tradable, or where there are other models of ownership? And so one of the agendas behind the paper that Berndt was referring to, that I've just published, one of the agenda items there is to try and broaden the discussion of ownership from the private-public distinction to take advantage of the information that we might be able to learn from the wide variety of forms of ownership and legal status of organizations that we have. And we're very fortunate in Britain to have the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, which covers a wide range of different forms of ownership as part of a nationally representative survey. So we can look at this and use this as a lens to try and see to what extent other forms of ownership, partnerships, charities, hybrid organizations in between public and private, and so on. And do these other forms of ownership favor some kind of contracting over intrinsic and extrinsic benefits? So that, and by implication from that, should we continue down the path of the Atlantic Consensus of vaunting the benefits of private ownership and of tradability of the assets of the Betrieb, or should we perhaps begin to think about how we could foster some of these other forms of ownership, and in doing so, whether we might enhance employee well-being? So that's basically I'd like just to take you through a very brief summary of the empirical results. And I can't do it with the presentation of Dieter or of Zig from earlier on, but let me just summarize it in terms of a diagram. What I've got here is a diagram showing the trade-offs between compensatory pay, that's the extra pay you might get for over and above your pay for your labor market qualifications on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, decreasing levels of work satisfaction. And the straight line that goes up at roughly 45 degrees through these in the chart illustrates what one might expect from compensating wage differentials theory, that the greater the degree of work dissatisfaction, the more compensatory pay, the more pay people would expect in compensation for giving up intrinsic benefits. The notable thing about the diagram is that if you're able to read the font, which I'm afraid has come out smaller than I intended, you'll notice that the observations are types of organization, types of organizational ownership, rather than individual firms or individual workers. And this is an important observation, because if one were just to plot the differences between compensatory pay and decreasing work satisfaction, one would just end up with a rather big cloud of dots all over the diagram, and no particular relationship emerging. But when one takes the mean values for different categories, such as the PLC, which is the one in the middle, companies limited by guarantee, hybrid organizations, charities, partnerships, and so on, one gets this rather different pattern. So it would seem then, from a cursory glance at this, then, that the trade-off between additional pay for unsatisfying work conditions exists, at least at the level of these patterns of ownership, even if it doesn't really show through very much at the other level. Now, this then is perhaps the prima facie argument then for saying that that the patterns of ownership matter when we consider about the feasibility of the trade-off. Now, let's just move on to think about some other possible explanations. Obviously, I'm sure the first question in many of your minds is that there must be some kind of composition and selection effects. In other words, perhaps collective bargaining is more strongly anchored in some of the forms of ownership than in others, and that this means that perhaps through enhanced employee voice, through collective bargaining, employees are better able to pin their employers down to their promises about satisfying work. That was included as a control variable of various kinds, and it doesn't affect the overall relationship. Again, another interpretation might be that workers are in low discretion jobs or routine jobs might be concentrated under some forms of ownership rather than others. And again, the composition effect there could mean that we're really looking at a rather spurious relationship. Again, we controlled for that, and the relationship proved to be robust. Finally, compensating wage differential theory stresses also the importance of organization scale and capital intensity. And again, controlling for that also leaves the relationship robust and in a strong position. So those variables which one might think of as underlying possible composition or selection effects don't change the basic underlying relationship, that it's the patterns of ownership that underpin the trade-off between intrinsic and extrinsic work benefits. Do compensatory wage differentials work without these ownership models? Well, we ran a rather different model for that. And what's noticeable was that although there's a weak correlation between compensatory pay and work dissatisfaction at the aggregate level, once we control for the patterns of ownership, again, we find that the patterns of ownership emerge as the most significant explanatory factors, and the overall correlation becomes non-significant. Now, so far this then perhaps it defines a pattern that these other forms of ownership support or facilitate negotiation of agreements over a trade-off between intrinsic and extrinsic work benefits. But that could still just be because of some kind of historical accident. If one wants to get really down to the element of trust that's important, in other words, employers will really only engage in this kind of negotiation of giving up extrinsic in favor of greater intrinsic benefits they'll only engage in this if they trust what the employer offers on the other side. So what we've done here is to look at the effect of the financial shock of the 2008 and 2009 financial crash. And there are a couple of things that we look at here. One is, you might think that if there's no employer commitment to intrinsic benefits, then employers will factor this in on hiring, and therefore they won't be upset if there's a major shock, because they will have expected perhaps the firm to pay something like, to use variable pay as a way of motivating people, but not used intrinsic benefits as a way of recruiting them. On the other hand, if the employers felt there was a strong employer commitment to respecting intrinsic benefits, then they might regard this as a form of breach. And a breach would lead to lower levels of satisfaction, work satisfaction, a commitment and trust. We test this by looking at the effects of the crisis on employees' work satisfaction and trust. The sense of breach was strongest among the employees who were most directly affected by the crash in their workplaces. And we noticed also that the effect was stronger when they were in sectors or ownership models where there was felt to be a stronger prior employer commitment. So broadly speaking, then, it would seem that there's a strong case, I would argue, for further research focusing not just on the public-private divide, but also looking at the other forms of ownership of organizations in the economy, and looking to see why it is that these seem to favor greater scope for providing workers with intrinsic work benefits, even at the cost of lesser extrinsic work benefits. And this, I would argue, would be one path one could go down in trying to think how to enrich the debate proposed by Sen and Stiglitz, when they're arguing that we need to think about not just material benefits of work, but also the subjective intrinsic work satisfaction benefits. I'd like to stop there because I'm sure Berndt has several questions, and I'm sure there are several questions that you have as well.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation. My first question is of a fairly general nature. I guess it is fair to read your paper as a demand for a convergence, let's say a convergence of labor economics and social psychology. The older colleagues remember the old times of industrial psychology, but this is different. So would you consider this, or would you recommend this, let's say, convergence or integration of subjective social psychological variables into labor economics thinking and research as a strategy for future research and teaching, maybe?
Yes, I think very much so, and that's a really important question that goes to the heart of the issue. I think if we are to go down the path that Sen and Stiglitz and others encourage us, and think of well-being in our economies as encompassing both the material benefits and also the work satisfaction and feeling of commitment and of kind of group recognition within workplaces. This is something that's really important for the future of our post-industrial societies. And as you point out, there are two quite distinct literatures. There has been some work trying to pull them together, notably by Sen and Stiglitz and others, but also I think one has to remember that there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's a difference of approach. On the one hand, from the psychological studies I've looked at, and which were largely left out of the paper because the referees weren't so keen on them.
Wrong referees for the paper, right?
Maybe the wrong referees, but maybe they thought each paper should deal with one issue rather than too many at the same time. But anyway, the psychologists, Ryan and Decci and others and their successors, emphasize very much the intrinsic benefits as part of basic human needs. Whereas the labor economists, on the other hand, work much more with the theory of choice and the idea that people make trade-offs between different types of benefits. And what I was trying to look at the way in which, even if both sets of theories are correct, there might be obstacles to the choice mechanisms, such as the dependence upon trust of the employer, because intrinsic benefits are not codifiable or measurable, and that it's the patterns of ownership which provide, if you like, an institutional support for different mixes of intrinsic and extrinsic benefits. So the psychologists and the labor economists, I think, also need the institutional input from, which I think has been very much a subject of the last 2 days, and the nature of the Betrieb.
Okay, thanks. Another question that came to my mind when I read your paper was the power issue. I mean, you just mentioned theory of choice, but some employees might not even have a choice. If they don't keep the job they have no job at all, or they might have difficulties finding a job without having a choice of intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards. So how do you cope with power relations, and maybe even with its different forms? You mentioned primary and secondary power. You mentioned individual and collective power, and so on and so forth. So how do you cope with these issues in the convergence of labor economics and social psychology?
I think in a way, in the paper as presented, the issue of power comes in some extent in terms of how far you can trust the commitments made by the other party. Is the other party going to renege on the promises it's made, and does it have the power to do so? If it does have the power to do so, then you have to, I guess, bargain for greater extrinsic benefits and put your eggs in that basket, because at least those benefits can be supported at an employment tribunal if you're feeling you're not being paid correctly, or you're being unfairly treated in the workplace. Power also comes in an aspect I didn't really talk about in the presentation, but is in the paper, and that is the power that workers have when they bring their human capital assets into the workplace. And for example, I think one reason why I split up the public sector into public administration, education and health, and then the small bit of nationalized industries, is that in both education and health, the employee human capital assets are extremely important. And that gives them a much more leverage vis-a-vis the employer to enforce an agreement about lower extrinsic rewards in favor of greater intrinsic rewards. It's for people in the kind of work situation we were discussing yesterday, in highly precarious employment, I guess there needs to be more thought about that, in that very often they have little in the way of valuable human capital assets, perhaps in the gig economy, riding for Deliveroo or and so on. And it would be interesting to see whether collective bargaining perhaps plays a greater role for people in that position. Well, of course, mostly they're not covered by bargaining. So there are elements of power, but I think there needs to be more work on the, particularly people in the kind of secondary labour market.
So the diversity, the growing diversity of the workforce needs,
yes,
of course, closer attention, right?
I think that's true.
Thinking of, let's say, extreme cases like 0-hour contracts in UK, or mini jobs in Germany, that would be of special interest also for practical purposes, but it cannot be included in only one paper, of course. Right?
No, and also, unfortunately, the statistical measurement of 0 hours contract is only just once we have a better measure of employment status, I think that something could be done with that. But at the moment, in Britain, as I think in many European countries, there's a sharp distinction between employees who have employment contracts on the one hand and independent self-employed workers on the other, which are easy to measure because the contracts are legally determined. But the grey area in between of the fake self-employment is a much more difficult one to tackle.
Then the next question is, you focus on ownership, and then you break up the public sector, and you have this privatized form of public industries. But otherwise, ownership, and this is in the paper, is pretty stable. Right?
Yes.
So doesn't this fact reduce the scope of choice, the opportunities of choice?
It might reduce the element of choice on the employer's side, I suppose, but looking at the panel survey, comparing the results for 2004 and 2011, only a small minority of workplaces changed their ownership pattern. And one could argue that the stability of the ownership pattern helps to stabilize expectations in the labour market, that you know a charity has a certain legal status and that's not likely to change in the next few years, or you know that a public limited company has a certain way of operating, which perhaps puts greater emphasis on extrinsic rather than intrinsic rewards. And again, that's not going to change greatly. So you could almost think of these models as kind of signals within the labour market, enabling workers to make choices about the kind of work they're going to be doing, the kind of intrinsic benefits that they'll get, what they can perhaps feel confident about sacrificing in terms of extrinsic rewards, knowing that this is a fairly stable pattern, and that employees will have adopted patterns they're not going to change. So the public limited companies with tradable ownership will emphasize extrinsic rewards, and the others will offer various mixes of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards.
So how about data? I mean, the data you work with are taken from the British Workplace Employment Relations Survey. What does this mean for the possibilities of transfer? I mean, the Hamburg group working on different projects on good work would, of course, and not only they, also all others, would be interested in this transfer aspect. I mean, this is a crucial question. And do you have any recommendations for, let's say, comparable research that could be done in Germany or any other, let's say, Western European countries? You are very familiar with the situation in France, of course, and other countries. So
France has a sister survey, which is very similar, except it focuses much more on the private sector and gives much less coverage to other alternative forms of ownership. I have been in discussion with Patrice Laroche about possibly extending this to a comparative level. But beyond that, quite a lot of the big surveys tend to focus on particular types of organizations, like the European Companies Survey, I think. And the great thing that WERS and Réponse offer is they have these separate elements: a survey of workplaces, which informs you about the company, and then a survey of individual employees in those organizations. This enables you to look at things like work satisfaction and various other well-being indicators. I don't know whether Germany has plans in it to move in this direction, but otherwise, I guess we have on the one hand the representative surveys like WERS and then the greater richness of the case studies that other colleagues have presented in the last 2 days. Be nice to have both.
Okay. Then you mentioned not only in the paper, but also in your presentation that control variables did not disturb the result. And you mentioned bargaining coverage, work systems, and even industry characteristics. So this is kind of surprising. And I remember one sentence Meyerhofer gave in his presentation yesterday, where he said, and I quote, "Well-being at different levels is of secondary importance only." Is this a contradiction, or how do we explain these differences?
I think one has to, I think they could well be compatible. The main thing from using the controls of bargaining, occupational mix, and capital intensity were really to try and not to show that these had no effect at all, but rather to show that any effect that they did have didn't negate the effect of ownership. So it didn't, for example, change the rank order of the different models of ownership in terms of compensatory pay and measures of work satisfaction.
Okay.
So I'd argue it's an additional variable, I'd argue.
Okay, so I checked the chat and nobody has asked a question. Therefore, we still can do that, or you can also raise your hands. I have one final question, and then we hand it over to the audience. You mentioned the consequences of the financial crisis 2008, 2009. Now we are in the middle of another serious, important crisis. So would you dare any prognosis about the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic? I know that predictions are always difficult. Somebody quoted yesterday, especially because they refer to the future, or if they refer to the future. So what is your best personal guess?
I think that the conditions for public limited companies will probably be less disrupted in terms of employee benefits than in the other forms of organization. And the reason is that private limited companies have often factored in a focus on extrinsic benefits. And so in a way, perhaps they're better placed to take a big external shock, which would be thought by employees to violate commitments to a greater recognition of intrinsic values of work. I think there's clearly a big challenge in the public sector. Just recently in Britain, and I'm sure this is the case across Europe, health service professionals have been working absolutely flat out, 200%, and yet the the budgetary scope for national governments to pay big pay increases to recognize the efforts of these employees are going to be extremely limited. And so I thought that would put the recognition of public sector employees, particularly say health employees or education employees, under great strain. They agree to certain sacrifice of extrinsic benefits in favor of greater intrinsic ones, but the work overload may simply swamp that in a way that the financial crisis also put pressure on these things back in about 10, 12 years ago.
So is this your research program for the next years, or could you elaborate a bit on forthcoming future, not too distant future projects?
The Wells survey has in terms of Brexit. I think it's been scrapped, and I suspect the reason behind that was the problem of paying for all the extra cost of Brexit. I don't have that on good authority, but it's just a suspicion. But I think that clearly one has to be inventive about exploring these issues without using other avenues of research.